Commander Vex watched the human settlement from orbit, dismissing their metal boxes as primitive. His xenobiologist called them a persistent fungal infection. Then the first electromagnetic pulse hit their systems. A human voice crackled through the speakers. "We consider any unauthorized interference to be an act of aggression." The experiment was over. War had begun. Commander Vex observed the colony from the command deck of the Star Sifter, an orbital vantage point designed for perfect surveillance. His ship hung in the silent void like a blade waiting to fall, every system humming with the quiet confidence of unquestioned superiority. The mission brief had classified this as pure xenological research, a standard observation of a developing species on Kepler 186f. They were here to document, to analyze, to gently provoke and measure reactions, nothing more. Dr. Kirathane's initial survey report lay open on his screen. Her conclusions were stark, clinical, and utterly dismissive. She hadn't categorized the inhabitants as intelligent life. Her preferred term was persistent fungal infection, a biological anomaly, a curiosity. Her scans showed no energy signatures beyond thermal and crude electrical patterns. Their structures were designated as metal boxes, temporary inefficient shelters compared to the elegant biodomes of civilized species. Vex read her notes without surprise. It matched his own assessment. He saw tenacity down there, a stubborn will to live in harsh conditions, but not strategy, not foresight. His fingers tapped the armrest of his command throne. Improvisation, yes. He'd watched them reroute power after a storm, patch hull breaches with whatever scrap was on hand. They were reactive, clever in a limited, desperate way. But cleverness wasn't wisdom. Adaptation wasn't advancement. In his eyes, they were creatures of instinct, not intellect. That framing, that fundamental misreading, was about to become the core of the conflict. It was the absolute confidence of a civilization that had never been truly surprised. A hubris so complete it blinded them to the possibility of a different kind of threat. Mission protocols were clear. They would administer gentle stimuli, a low-yield electromagnetic pulse, a subtle ionization of the upper atmosphere, tools designed to elicit fear or confusion in a primitive society. They expected chaos, a scattering, maybe some ritualized panic. The science team had even calibrated their sensors specifically for low-order reactions, elevated heart rates, localized fires, vocal distress patterns. They were not looking for coordination. They weren't even looking for a response. They were watching for a reaction. Vex gave the order. The first pulse was fired. It was a precise, controlled emission, a flick of a switch from an orbit away. To the crew of the Star Sifter, it was a benign gesture. A scientist prodding an anthill. Their instruments recorded the emission's clean exit from their array. It was perfect. Textbook. On their screens, the human settlement's simple energy grid flickered and died, exactly as predicted. They settled back. They began logging the expected collapse of a primitive society. They did not notice their own comms flicker a half-second later. A tiny power fluctuation in a non-critical system. An anomaly. They marked it for later review. The experiment was proceeding as planned. The piece is over. Their pulse was not a nudge. It was a surgical strike, a clean cut meant to observe a primitive system's collapse. Instead, the Star Sifter's own bridge lighting flickered. A low hum from the environmental controls stuttered. The main tactical display wavered for a full second before stabilizing. Minor systems across the ship reported power fluctuations. Nothing critical. Nothing that tripped a single alarm. But it was there. A subtle, impossible echo of their own action. This was not the result their models predicted. The pulse was low yield. A scientific instrument, not a weapon. The colony's simple electrical grid should have simply died. They should have seen darkness and panic. They did not expect a response. They certainly did not expect a coordinated one. The data stream from the planet showed their pulse hit its target. The settlement's lights went out. For 3 full seconds, there was only the blackout they had anticipated. Then the backups kicked in, not with a surge. With a snap, a series of precise localized reactivations. Sector by sector, light returned. The power signatures that flared to life were cleaner, more focused than before. They weren't just restoring what was lost. They were rerouting, reinforcing. The speed of it defied every parameter in the alien database. This wasn't the reaction of a scared animal. It was the counterpunch of a thinking opponent, every comm channel on the bridge, every open frequency on the ship, filled with a wave of static. Then a single voice cut through the noise. It was a woman's voice, calm, clear, utterly devoid of panic or question. It carried the flat, hard tone of absolute authority. Luna Torres did not ask who they were. She did not demand an explanation. She simply identified their action and stated its consequence. Her words were not a plea or a threat. They were a statement of fact, a boundary drawn in steel and transmitted across the void. We consider any unauthorized interference with our equipment to be an act of aggression. There was no ambiguity, no room for negotiation. The sentence hung in the air of the bridge, and in that moment, the entire nature of their mission changed. Commander Vex felt it shift. The comfortable fiction of scientific observation evaporated. The sterile data points on his screen were no longer measurements of a subject. They were the opening moves of an engagement. He was no longer an observer perched safely above a lab experiment. He was a combatant who had just thrown the first punch and found his target already braced for the impact. The ship's silence was no longer the quiet of control. It was the quiet of shock. Down on the colony, the lights burned steadily. Their grids were reconfigured, hardened. They had absorbed the first blow and answered it not with a scream, but with a declaration. The experiment was over. The war had just received its opening statement. Luna Torres's voice was not a warning. It was a command. The colony did not descend into chaos. It organized. Across the dusty plains and between the low metal shelters, a system began to reboot itself. The aliens, watching from their silent perch, expected a primitive society to fracture under stress. They expected fear. They saw instead a chilling, silent efficiency. This was not a militia forming. It was an entire settlement transforming into a single instrument. Engineers and farmers moved with a purpose that defied their civilian designations. They did not run. They coordinated. Salvaged gear from storage lockers was hauled into the open. Components meant for repairing atmospheric processors were repurposed into communication relays. Heavy construction equipment, once used for digging foundations, was retrofitted. A rock grinder's massive treads were locked, its chassis reinforced with scrap plating, turning it into a stationary strongpoint. The so-called metal boxes of the settlement were no longer just homes. Their thick walls became defensive perimeters. Their power conduits were rerouted to feed into a newly forming network. The mirror arrays presented the first major puzzle. Vast fields of reflective panels, engineered to concentrate sunlight for crop growth, began to move in unison. Their gentle sun-tracking rotations ceased. With a low grinding hum, every array tilted upward. Their purpose shifted in an instant. They were no longer tools for growth. They became weapons of glare. They focused the raw energy of the local star, not into power collectors, but into a single searing beam aimed at the orbiting ship. The effect was immediate and disorienting. On the star sifter, sensor feeds flickered with intense light pollution. Targeting systems struggled to filter out the blinding glare. The humans were not generating a new energy signal to jam them. They were using the sun itself. They had turned their environment into a shield. It was a defensive action executed with offensive precision. Further adaptations emerged from their industrial sectors. The water purification plant, a facility the aliens had logged as a simple life support system, underwent a rapid recalibration. Its powerful intake pumps reversed their flow cycle. Instead of pulling water in, they began pumping it out at high pressure through modified filtration nozzles, creating a dense ionized mist around key sectors of the colony. The mist clung to structures, distorting thermal signatures and scattering low-frequency scans. A tool for survival became a tool for obfuscation. This was the revelation. The humans were not revealing a hidden capacity for war. They were demonstrating a fundamental trait the aliens had completely misjudged. They treated all technology, all infrastructure, as a flexible toolkit. Nothing had a single purpose. Everything was a component waiting to be reassembled for a new need. A farming mirror could become a dazzler. A water pump could become a smoke generator. Their improvisation was not the random flailing of a primitive mind. It was strategic, directed, and terrifyingly effective. They were not building an army. They were reprogramming their entire world into a fortress. Dr. Kirathane's monitor array told a story her training refused to believe. The data streams pulsed with coordinated energy signatures, dense communications traffic, and a resource allocation pattern that was anything but primitive. Her scientific curiosity, once a cool and analytical force, curdled into a low-grade alarm. This was not the disorganized scatter of a disrupted colony. It was the emergence of a system. A sophisticated one. The patterns were advanced, tightly woven, and completely absent from every xenological profile in the Directorate's vast databases. They had no file for this. She isolated the energy source, jamming their mid-range sensors. It wasn't a generator. It was the focused solar reflection from the agricultural mirrors. The colonists had calculated the exact angle and intensity required to flood their orbital scans with targeted electromagnetic interference. This was not a panicked, defensive measure. It was an offensive action, a deliberate weaponization of their environment. They were using the planet's own star to blind their observers. The audacity of the solution was matched only by its efficiency. They had turned sunlight into a shield and a sword. On her main screen, the settlement's thermal map was reforming. The scattered heat signatures of individual dwellings were coalescing. They were building a fortified perimeter. What had been a peaceful outpost hours before was now a hardened defensive position. The transformation was happening in real time, a rapid metamorphosis from community to citadel. It was gaining cohesion with every passing minute. The metal boxes were now interconnected strongpoints. Movement between them was minimal and purposeful. They were not hiding. They were digging in. She opened a direct channel to the command throne. Her report to Vex was concise, stripped of all scientific jargon. She stated the facts. The colony's defensive measures now constituted a credible threat to their mission and their ship. The low-yield provocations were over. The situation no longer felt like a study. It felt like a siege, but the experts conducting it were not on her ship. They were on the surface, solving technical problems with methods her databases claimed were generations beyond their reach. They were breaking known physics with farming equipment. Vex listened in silence. He had trusted a clear, linear hierarchy of technological progress. His entire career was built upon it. A civilization with metal boxes and chemical engines belonged on one rung. A civilization with gravity drives and quantum entanglement belonged on another. The latter was absolute. The distance between the rungs was vast and unbreachable, or so he had believed. Now he faced a disquieting thought that threatened the foundation of that belief. The humans were not climbing the ladder. They were ignoring it completely. They were solving for the answer without following the approved steps. Their binary view of the universe, primitive equals inferior, advanced equals superior, was not just incorrect. It was a liability. It was a crack in their worldview, and the reality of Kepler was pouring through it. The assumption that a lack of advanced technology meant a lack of advanced thinking might be the most dangerous miscalculation he had ever made. He had come to study a simple organism. He was now engaged with a complex, adaptive, and highly intelligent adversary. The lab specimen was not in the cage. They were standing outside it, quietly locking the door. The experiment was no longer about measuring human fear. It was about surviving human ingenuity. The humans stopped reacting. They started learning. The shift was subtle at first, a change in the pattern of their energy emissions, a new density to their data traffic. Then it became undeniable. They turned their full attention upward, not in fear, but in analysis. The Star Sifter, a marvel of technology built on principles humanity had not yet even named, hung in the sky. Its quantum-entangled communications, its gravity-based propulsion, its adaptive crystalline hull, these were not just advanced. They were, by every human standard, magical. Black boxes, impenetrable. A fortress of science that should have been utterly invulnerable to their primitive probes. It was not. They began to read the ship by its own light. Every system, no matter how advanced, produces emissions. Waste heat, gravitational distortions, subtle quantum fluctuations. The humans mapped these. They did not try to build a gravity drive from scratch. They used their retasked radio telescopes and their recalibrated seismic sensors to listen to the ship's own hum. They built a vibration profile of its engines. They charted the minute warping of space around its hull. They were not looking at the locked door. They were studying the vibrations in the frame. Their main communications relay, a dish array for talking to orbiting satellites, underwent another repurposing. Teams of engineers and physicists swarmed over it. integrating components from power grid regulators and even medical imaging systems. They were not enhancing its broadcast ability. They were turning it into a receiver of an entirely different order. They began applying principles of gravitational lensing. They used the massive gravity well of the planet itself, combined with the subtle distortions from the ship, to bend light and other emissions. They weren't just listening to the ship's noise. They were using physics as a lens to peer through its hull. They were building a picture of its internal layout from the outside, using math and willpower instead of a scanner. They turned their attention to the sky itself. The ionosphere, a chaotic layer of charged particles, had been a tool in the alien playbook. They had used delicate manipulations of it for their atmospheric tests. Now the humans seized control of it. Using a network of reactivated ground-to-orbit comm lasers and the colony's main power grid, they generated a series of coordinated energy pulses. They did not just disrupt the ionosphere. They shaped it. They created a localized, fluctuating lens of charged particles that bent and distorted the Starsifter's own sensor beams back upon itself. It was a feat the alien science logs claimed required technology centuries beyond human reach. The humans did it with a power grid and a lot of nerve. They were using the aliens' own environmental manipulations as a weapon, turning their scientific tools into a hall of mirrors. Dr. Kirathane watched the data cascade across her screens. Her initial alarm was now curdling into a cold professional dread, mixed with a sliver of unwanted respect. This was beyond adaptation. They weren't just finding new uses for old tools. They were comprehending the underlying principles of technology they had never seen before. They were iterating on alien science in real time. They saw the effect and reverse-engineered the cause. They observed a capability and deduced the mechanism. Her monitors showed them improving their techniques with each pass, their countermeasures growing more refined, more targeted, more confident. The observers had become the observed. The scientists were now the specimens under the microscope. The subjects of the experiment were no longer on the surface. They were on the bridge, watching in horror as their own technology was dissected and understood by a species they had written off as fungus. The humans were not fighting a war. They were conducting a master class. They were writing a new textbook on warfare with every move. And the first lesson was that no technology is a black box to a sufficiently clever and determined mind. The gap between primitive and advanced was not a chasm. It was a tide, and it was coming in. The Starsifter's shields were down, not the energy barriers around its hull. The enemy was not outside. The enemy was in the wires. The most profound shock did not come from a missile or a beam. It came from a screen. Commander Vex's command console flickered once. A cold, unauthorized data stream forced its way onto his main viewer, bypassing every security protocol. It shoved his tactical readouts aside. The feed was not scrambled or jammed. It was pristine. Crystal clear. It was a live feed from his own internal security network. The angle was from a camera mounted high in the corner of his own bridge. He saw the back of his own head. He saw his crew at their stations. He saw Dr. Kirathane at her science console, her brow furrowed in concentration. With a silent, seamless cut, the view switched. Now it showed his main engineering bay. Technicians moved between the humming gravity drive cores, performing routine diagnostics. They had no idea they were being watched. The view cut again. His mess hall, his armory, his personal quarters. The feed cycled through every secured deck, every critical system. The angles were from his own cameras, the ones he controlled, the ones that were supposed to be secure. A human voice spoke over the feed. Luna's voice. It was calm. It held no trace of static. It sounded as if she were standing next to him on the bridge. "We have known about your arrival before you finished achieving orbit." The statement was simple, absolute. It landed not like a boast, but like a fact. A prelude to a lesson. This intrusion was not some lucky hack. It was not random espionage. It was the result of a deliberate, comprehensive counterintelligence operation. It had scope. It had depth. It had been running since the beginning. The security feed on the main viewer dissolved. In its place, a new schematic appeared. It was a complete internal topography of the Starsifter, deck by deck, system by system. It was more detailed than the blueprints in his own database. Conduits he had forgotten were mapped. Maintenance crawlways were highlighted. Then the schematic shifted again. It began to annotate itself. Text boxes popped up, pointing to specific junctions. They highlighted points of failure in his quantum-entangled communications array. They identified a resonance weakness in the microwave radiation shielding around the primary reactor. They were not just showing him his ship. They were showing him how to break it. Vex felt the command throne beneath him. He felt the solidity of his ship. But the feeling was an illusion, a fantasy of isolation that had just been shattered. They were never hidden. They were never the unseen observers. From the moment they dropped out of faster-than-light travel, they had been on display. Their every move had been logged. Their every system had been probed and analyzed. The colony's entire reaction, from the first EMP counterpunch to the mirror arrays to the ionospheric manipulation, was not a desperate defense. It was a calibrated countermeasure, a series of controlled experiments designed to force a specific response, to make them reveal more of their capabilities, to make them commit. The humans had not been trying to drive them away. They had been trying to understand them, to measure them, to force a complete and total rethinking of their mission by demonstrating, beyond any doubt, that the mission was already a catastrophic failure. The observers were the observed. The hunters were the hunted. The security of the most advanced ship in the sector was a joke they had already understood and dismantled. The shield was not a barrier. It was a window, and the humans had been looking through it the entire time. Their declaration of war was not the start of a conflict. It was the culmination of a long, patient study. A new data packet arrived on the Starsifter's bridge. It bypassed every security filter. It did not carry a virus. It did not contain a weapon. It was a report. The transmission was clean, formatted perfectly to their own scientific standards. The title was clinical. Behavioral Analysis Kepler Expedition. Command and Science Personnel. The subjects listed were Commander Vex and Dr. Kirathane. Their crew was designated as the secondary test group. Luna's voice accompanied the data, her tone flat and analytical. She explained the true nature of the encounter with a chilling, dispassionate candor. The human response was never about resilience. It was never about desperation or fear. That was the framework the aliens had built for them. The humans had a different framework. Their research was not about how they would react. It was about how the aliens would react. "We have been feeding you carefully controlled responses," she stated. The sentence landed in the quiet bridge like a physical blow, designed to escalate your involvement. Every action the colony had taken from the very first second was a calibrated piece of data. The immediate coordinated counter to the EMP was not a lucky break. It was a pre-planned reaction, designed to be just effective enough to be surprising, but not so effective as to be unbelievable. It was bait. The mirror arrays turning upward were not a desperate defensive measure. They were a provocation. The calculated intensity of the reflected light was designed to be a credible, annoying threat. It was meant to force a specific counter-reaction from the ship, to make them reveal more of their sensor capabilities and their tactical playbook. The manipulation of the ionosphere, the rerouting of power, the creation of the mist shield. Each was a carefully measured escalation. A move in a game the aliens did not know they were playing. The goal was never to drive the Starsifter away. The goal was to lure its crew deeper in, to get them to commit more resources, to use more advanced systems to reveal more of their technological and psychological profile. Every human action was a question designed to elicit a measurable answer. They wanted the aliens to justify, through their own escalating actions, a more comprehensive human response. They needed a reason to fully unpack their own toolkit, to move from observation to full analysis. Vex looked from the report on his screen to the live feed of his own bridge still playing in the corner. He understood. The horror was not in the defeat. It was in the role reversal. They were not the scientists. They were the test subjects. Their every decision, their every arrogant assumption, their every condescending log entry had been observed, measured, and catalogued. Their professional reputations, their careers, the very legitimacy of the entire Galactic Science Directorate now hung in the balance of a human experiment. Their mission was not a failure. It was a data set, a case study in hubris, a perfect record of how a supposedly superior civilization walks itself into a trap, convinced the entire time that it is holding the leash. The observers had become the specimens, and their performance was now being graded. Luna Torres did not build a weapon. She built a broadcast. The ultimate strategic advantage was not a gun or a shield. It was a light. A light shone directly into the darkest corners of the Galactic Science Directorate's own records. She used the Starsifter's compromised data link like a key. It was still their lock. She just knew how to turn it. She did not break into the mission database. She walked through the open door their own security failure had created. She did not steal the data. She copied it, every byte, every log, every transmission. Then she compiled it. She built a new file structure around their own information. She did not edit their words. She framed them. She added her own commentary in the margins, not opinions, facts. She linked their condescending log entries to the specific human actions they had misread. She connected their arrogant research methods to the ethical precedents they had shattered. She turned their own mission logs into an indictment written in their own hand. The package was not a attack. It was a presentation, a case file. She opened a channel directly to Vex's command console. She showed him the completed package. Then she showed him the transmission log. A list of destinations scrolled down the main viewer. 43 different addresses, 43 different species, all members of the Directorate's own coalition, all recipients of the complete unedited data dump. She had not just accessed their secrets. She had mailed them to their neighbors. The transmission was already complete. The data was already loose in the wild. It could not be called back. It could not be suppressed. The package contained everything. Their initial mission parameters, authorizing gentle provocations on an unsuspecting species. Dr. Kirathane's report labeling humans a persistent fungal infection, raw sensor data from their electromagnetic pulse attack, their internal communications debating the ethics of proceeding without informed consent. Their own words, their own actions laid bare. The entire encounter was instantly reframed. It was no longer a secret science mission gone wrong. It was a public scandal. A case study in institutional arrogance and ethical failure. The aliens' methods, their condescension, their very existence were now on display for the entire galaxy to judge. The humans' greatest weapon was transparency. They turned their own humiliation into a shield. Their leverage was no longer tactical. It was not about ship-to-ship combat or orbital dominance. It was existential. The cost of failure for the Directorate was no longer the loss of a single ship and its crew. That was a manageable loss, a budget line. The cost was now the complete and total loss of their credibility, their scientific authority, their right to speak for galactic ethics, their standing among the other 43 species who now possessed proof of their grotesque hypocrisy. The line between scientific inquiry and coercive power dissolved. The Directorate's entire philosophy was built on the idea that their advanced technology granted them the right to observe, to test, to categorize. That their intelligence gave them authority. Luna's broadcast exposed that idea as a thin veil for predation. They were not scholars. They were intruders. The weapon was not a beam of energy. It was the truth, packaged and delivered to every corner of their own political sphere. The battle was over. The audit had begun. The humans had not won a war. They had triggered an inquisition, and the first piece of evidence was the defendant's own confession. The forward airlock of the Starsifter cycled open without a command. The ship's internal monitors showed the status as a solid, calm green. Normal operation. No alarm sounded. No alert flashed on any screen. The security systems, the ones designed to detect unauthorized entry, registered nothing. To the ship's own logic, the event was not happening. The heavy door hissed open, revealing the stark, sterile corridor of the loading bay. A figure stood in the opening. Luna Torres stepped onto the deck. She wore a standard human environment suit, a practical combination of sealed fabric and composite plates. It was functional, unremarkable. She carried no weapon. Her hands were empty. She was alone. The act was not an invasion. It was a visitation. She moved into the corridor with a calm, casual authority that was more unnerving than any show of force. She did not look around in wonder or confusion. Her movements were direct, purposeful. She turned down a side passage without hesitation. She knew the layout. She knew it intimately. She walked onto the bridge. The crew turned from their stations. Their faces showed a mix of shock and disbelief. This was impossible. She stopped a few paces from Commander Vex's command throne. Her posture was relaxed. She did not look like a conqueror. She looked like an engineer reporting for a shift. She spoke. Her voice was level, clear. She did not need to raise it. She stated that they had been mapping the Star Sifter's hull and internal systems since the first day it achieved orbit. They used gravitational lensing. They bent the fabric of local space with planetary gravity and their own retasked sensor arrays to see through the advanced alloys. They built a perfect, three-dimensional model of the entire ship, down to the smallest maintenance conduit. They knew every corridor, every room, every system junction. Then she revealed the deeper truth. She had not just mapped the ship. She had mastered it. She had pulled full authorization and access codes from their own networked systems. Their security had a single fatal flaw. It was built on a foundation of arrogance. They assumed no one would even think to try and interfere with quantum-entangled communications or the core principles of gravitational manipulation. The technology was too advanced. The concepts were too abstract. It was a lock with no keyhole because they believed no one would know a key was needed. The humans did not make that assumption. They saw a system and tested its limits. They probed its edges. They found the keyhole. Then they built the key. She could disable life support with a thought. She could vent the atmosphere from the command deck. She could shut down the gravity drive and leave them adrift. She could control the ship at will. Their most advanced systems were now her tools. The standoff on the bridge was silent. It was no longer a conflict between a warship and a colony. The scale of the engagement had collapsed into that single room. It was now between Luna Torres and the bridge crew. She held every card. Their weapons were useless. Their technology was hers. Their security was a joke she had already decoded. They were not prisoners in their own ship. They were exhibits. She had not come to fight them. She had come to demonstrate that the fight was already over, and they had lost it without ever understanding the rules. The intruder was not a threat. She was the new administrator, and she was here to collect the keys. Luna Torres did not explain her people's technology. She explained their memory. The fight was not in the wires or the reactors. It was in the history books. She turned to the alien main viewer. With a silent command from her wrist unit, she replaced the ship's schematics. New images filled the screen. Not diagrams of systems. Not plans, footage. Grainy black and white archival records from another world, another time. She showed them Earth. She showed them prisoners in a cell block. Men deliberately left to suffer from a curable disease so researchers could document its final stages. She showed them psychological studies designed to break the human mind, conducted on subjects who never knew they were part of an experiment. She showed them facilities where biological agents were tested on populations without their knowledge, without their consent, without any regard for their lives. The footage was stark, clinical in its horror. It was not propaganda. It was evidence. She did not stop with the atrocities. She showed them the aftermath. Stone memorials carved with the names of the forgotten. Long, solemn court proceedings where the perpetrators were forced to account for their actions. The slow, painful, generations-long development of ethical standards. The creation of review boards. The establishment of rules. The hard-won principle that no scientific inquiry was worth a single life taken without its consent. She showed them the cost of learning that lesson. The mountains of dead it took to build that wall. She turned back to Commander Vex. Her voice was quiet on the bridge, but it carried the weight of centuries. Humanity's claim to science, she stated, does not rest on conquest. It does not rest on who has the better technology or the bigger ship. It rests on consent. It rests on accountability. It rests on the blood-soaked understanding of what happens when those principles are ignored. Their entire civilization built itself back from that brink. They inscribed those hard lessons into their laws, their education, their very culture. The alien experiment did not trigger a simple military response. It was not about territory or resources. It triggered a deep cultural immune response, a defense mechanism forged in the fires of those past ethical catastrophes. The aliens' unauthorized probes, their electromagnetic pulses, their atmospheric tests, these were not just hostile acts. They were echoes. They were a perfect, terrible echo of the worst moments of human history. It was the same arrogance, the same casual dismissal of a people's right to control their own bodies and their own lives. The same poisonous idea that knowledge was more important than dignity. This is why the human reaction was so absolute, so thorough, so merciless in its efficiency. It was not a strategy devised for this single encounter. It was a prepared protocol, a drilled response to a specific kind of pathogen. a societal antibody designed to identify and neutralize the virus of unethical experimentation on site. Their focus was not on destroying the ship. It was on disclosure, on forcing the truth into the light, because they knew from bitter experience that secrecy was the enemy's greatest weapon. The confrontation on the bridge shifted. The tension in the air changed quality. It was no longer about tactical posturing or technological superiority. The discussion was no longer about shields and firepower. It was about principles. It was about history. It was a direct ethical challenge delivered from the deck of their own ship. Luna was not just a soldier defending her home. She was an advocate from a species that had already fought this war within itself and had the scars to prove it. They were not facing a primitive fungus. They were facing the living ghost of their own potential for cruelty, and it was holding them accountable for sins they had not even realized they were committing. The battlefield was no longer in space. It was in their own conscience. Luna Torres did not demand tribute. She demanded reform. She stood on the alien bridge, an unarmed woman in a room full of weapons, and laid out the terms for a peaceful resolution. The humans would not destroy the Star Sifter. They would not take prisoners. They would not claim territory. Their demands were not for spoils. They were for a fundamental change in the rules. The terms placed humanity in charge of the process. They were not negotiating. They were dictating the new terms of engagement for an entire civilization. The first term was absolute. The Galactic Science Directorate would adopt and enforce a policy of informed consent for all xenobiological research. No more hidden observation posts. No more gentle provocations. No more experiments on unsuspecting species. Every study, every first contact, every interaction would require the voluntary understood agreement of the subject civilization. The principle was non-negotiable. It would be embedded in their charter, their laws, their very operational doctrine. The age of unquestioned scientific authority was over. The second term established a new political reality. The Directorate would enter into formal diplomatic relations with humanity, recognizing them as a sovereign power. Not a subject species, not a curiosity. An equal, a partner. This meant embassies, open communication channels, a seat at whatever table governed interstellar affairs. Humanity would no longer be an entry in a database. They would be a voice in the conversation. Their sovereignty was not a request. It was a condition. The third term targeted the language itself. The Directorate would publicly abandon the term primitive as a classification. It would be struck from their databases, their training manuals, their scientific lexicon. The word was a misnomer. It implied a hierarchy where one civilization was deficient and another was advanced. The new framework would be built on the concept of divergence. A species that lived in metal boxes was not backward. It might prioritize adaptability over permanence, survival aesthetics over architectural elegance. Their technology was not inferior. It was different. The word primitive was a weapon of prejudice. It would no longer be used. Commander Vex and Dr. Kirathane heard the terms. They understood the gravity. They had not just lost a skirmish. They had broken something fundamental in the order of things. They had forced a species to defend its most basic right to exist without being a subject of study, and in doing so, they had shattered the foundation of their own authority. The cost of refusal was clear. Luna's data packet was already loose. Refusal meant the immediate broadcast of their complete failure. It meant the end of their careers. It meant a galactic scandal that would hollow out the Directorate's credibility for generations. They would be remembered as the commanders who turned a science mission into an ethical disaster. But the cost of acceptance was its own kind of defeat. It meant the end of their way of life, the end of uncontested scientific authority, the end of the comfortable, arrogant certainty that their technology placed them at the top of a cosmic ladder. Accepting these terms meant their entire civilization would have to look in the mirror and change. It meant restructuring centuries of doctrine, retraining every scientist, rewriting every textbook. They recognized the cascade of consequences that would now flow back through their society. The shockwave would reach the highest levels of the Directorate. It would challenge core beliefs. It would force a humility they had never needed to learn. The choice was not between victory and defeat. It was between a loud public humiliation and a quiet institutional revolution. They had come to study a fungus. They were being asked to replant their entire garden. The data packet reached the High Council. The scandal could not be contained. The transmission was not a request for their opinion. It was a presentation of evidence. The information was packaged, formatted, and delivered directly to their most secure chambers. It arrived not as a pirate broadcast, but as a clean, official-looking file. It used their own formatting, their own protocols. It was irrefutable. It contained the Directorate's own mission logs, their internal communications, their sensor records. It showed the electromagnetic pulse attack. It showed Dr. Kirathane's fungal infection report. It showed every moment of their arrogant, unforced error. The Council was not being asked to adjudicate. They were being shown a mirror. They had a choice. A simple, brutal choice. They could protect the old ways. They could circle their ships, deny the evidence, and attempt to weather the storm of ridicule and distrust from the 43 other species who now possessed the same data. They could try to preserve a system built on the comfortable certainty of their own superiority. Or they could accept a new, uncomfortable truth. They could admit that their foundational principles were not just flawed but dangerous, that their entire approach to science was built on a pillar of ethical sand. The vote was not close. It was unanimous. The Galactic Science Directorate would adopt Luna Taurus's protocols wholesale, every term, without amendment. The decision was recorded, stamped, and transmitted back to the Star Sifter and to every member world. It was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. A complete and total capitulation. The age of unaccountable observation was over. Unauthorized experimentation was banned. Not restricted. Not regulated, banned. The concept of primitive was officially struck from all official documents, all training manuals, all scientific literature. It was reframed. The new classification system would be based on technological and cultural divergence, not a linear hierarchy. A species that lived in metal boxes was not backward. It was different. Its priorities were its own. This was more than a change in policy. It was a philosophical earthquake, a pivot point for interstellar law and ethics that would ripple across known space for centuries. The Council's acceptance marked a profound shift in the balance of power. It was not a surrender to human military might. The humans had not fired a single weapon that could physically destroy the Star Sifter. They had not needed to. This was a surrender to the power of their principle. They had been defeated by an idea. The idea that consent was not an obstacle to science, but its foundation. That respect was not a luxury, but a requirement. A final assessment from Commander Vex was included in the official record. His closing thoughts were relayed to the Council as part of the surrender package. His words were studied, sober, and carried the weight of hard experience. He stated that humans may not be the most advanced warriors in the galaxy. They did not have the largest fleet or the most powerful energy weapons. But they were, in his professional opinion, the most dangerous. They think like master strategists, seeing 10 moves ahead on a board their opponents do not even know exists. But they fight like a species that has been trying to kill itself for millennia. They have a deep, intimate, and horrifying familiarity with every form of betrayal, every ethical shortcut, every arrogant overreach. They have been on both sides of that transaction. They know how the story ends. The true engine of interstellar science was no longer pure discovery. It was no longer about who could see the furthest or probe the deepest. The new engine, the only engine that would now be permitted to run, was built on 3 simple pillars: consent, respect, and accountability. The humans had not brought a new technology to the galaxy. They had brought a new moral framework. And they had forced the most advanced civilization in known space to adopt it at the point of a truth they could not refute. The lesson was not written in fire. It was written in data, and it would never be forgotten. 3 cycles later, Commander Vex stood before the High Council of the Galactic Science Directorate. The chamber was vast, silent, and cold. The audience watching him was not a group of peers. It was a tribunal of the most powerful scientists and admirals in known space. Their faces were neutral masks, but the weight of their judgment filled the air like a physical pressure. His final mission report was not a defense. It was a confession. He stood at the podium, his posture rigid, his voice stripped of all command authority. He admitted point by point that the behavioral study had resulted in the complete compromise of their mission parameters, their ship's integrity, their secured databases, and their collective professional credibility. He did not use euphemisms. He did not soften the facts. He laid out the failure in clean clinical terms. He took full responsibility. He did not blame human treachery or unpredictable technology. He placed the fault squarely on alien hubris. He detailed every critical miscalibration, the assumption that technological disparity meant intellectual inferiority, the belief that their advanced systems were inherently secure against a primitive species, the ethical blindness that allowed them to treat a sovereign civilization as a collection of test subjects. He named each assumption. He explained how each one had been systematically exploited and broken. His conclusion was stark. The cost of failing to adapt, of clinging to their outdated doctrines, would have been far greater than the cost of their surrender. To continue the engagement would not have been a fight for victory. It would have been a protracted public demolition of their entire institutional legitimacy. The human strategy was not designed to destroy their ship. It was designed to destroy their credibility. Surrender was the only logical move. It was a strategic retreat from a battle they had already lost the moment it began. The report became infamous overnight. It was downloaded, disseminated, and studied across the galaxy, but it was not studied for its scientific findings. There were none. It was studied as the ultimate textbook case on how not to conduct first contact. It was a masterclass in catastrophic failure. Academies used it to teach cadets about the dangers of cultural arrogance. Ethics boards used it to illustrate the absolute necessity of informed consent. It was a permanent glaring example of what happens when science forgets its moral obligations. Commander Vex's career was effectively over. He would never command a ship again. He would never lead another mission. But his name, and his report, achieved a different kind of immortality. They became a permanent cautionary tale, a ghost story told to young scientists to warn them against the poison of unquestioned superiority. His warning served as a stark monument to the price of hubris. The Directorate itself began the long, painful process of reform. Committees were formed. Protocols were rewritten from the ground up. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize cultural relativism and ethical frameworks. The very language of xenology was purged of condescending terminology. It was an institutional detox, a necessary purification after a near-fatal dose of its own arrogance. A new era began for interstellar relations. But it did not begin with a triumphant treaty signing or a glorious ceremony. It began with a public admission of failure. It began in that silent council chamber, with a disgraced commander reading a list of his own mistakes into the official record. The foundation for a new galactic order was not built on a victory. It was poured into the crater left by a spectacular defeat. The first step forward was a look backward, at everything they had done wrong and a promise, etched in the shame of that moment to never make those same mistakes again. Luna Torres's image appeared on the main viewer of the High Council chamber. It was a secure link, crystal clear. She did not stand on a bridge or in a command center. She sat at a simple workstation on the surface of Kepler. The human who engineered their humiliation was now offering them a path forward. She did not look like a victor. She looked like a diplomat. Her expression was calm. Her tone was level. There was no glint of triumph in her eyes, only a firm, unwavering certainty. She addressed the silent council. She did not begin with a list of demands. She began with an explanation. She told them why. She connected the humans' absolute coordinated reaction directly to their own historical trauma. She spoke of Earth's past. She described the dark eras of unauthorized medical testing, the psychological experiments on unaware subjects, the biological trials conducted without consent. She named these events not as ancient history but as living wounds. She stated that their civilization's claim to science was built on the bones of those failures. It was founded on the hard-won principle that no discovery was worth a single life taken without its permission. The alien electromagnetic pulse was not just an attack. It was an echo, a perfect terrible echo of that old pain. It was the same arrogance, the same dismissal of a people's right to control their own existence. This is why the response was not a negotiation. It was an immune response, a societal antibody activating to fight a familiar pathogen. She made them understand that they were not fighting humans. They were fighting human history. And human history is a long, bloody lesson in what happens when ethics are abandoned. She did not gloat over their surrender. She offered a partnership. Her proposal was clear and direct. She outlined the framework for cooperative voluntary research agreements, joint studies, shared scientific ventures, exchanges of data and personnel. The offer was genuine. It held the promise of real mutual advancement. Astonishing discoveries were possible, but only through a new lens of transparency and respect. The subtext, however, was immovable. The old way was gone. The predatory science of observation and provocation was finished. The new way, the way of partnership, was not an option. It was the only way forward. Her closing statement was not a threat. It was a piece of advice, simple, devastating. It would resonate across countless civilizations for cycles to come. She looked directly into the camera, her gaze holding the entire council. "Next time you want to study human behavior," she said, her voice utterly flat, "try introducing yourselves first." The sentence hung in the air of the council chamber. It reframed the entire conflict in 7 words. The problem was never their curiosity. It was their method. The lack of consent. The failure to extend the most basic courtesy of a greeting. That single act of introduction would have changed everything. It would have established respect. It would have built a foundation for dialogue instead of distrust. It suggested a future not of conflict but of collaboration. A future where first contact began with a handshake, not a censor sweep. The council listened. The silence in the chamber was absolute. They heard the offer. They heard the warning. They saw the woman on the screen. For the first time, they did not see a biological anomaly. They did not see a persistent fungal infection or a primitive subject. They saw a potential ally, a species with a harsh past and a stubborn commitment to its principles, a people who could have chosen vengeance but instead chose to teach a lesson. They saw the end of one era of galactic science and the difficult, necessary birth of another. The path was clear. It began with a simple, humbling act. It began with an introduction. The word primitive was deleted, not revised, not reclassified, stripped from the official lexicon of the Galactic Science Directorate. A single command wiped it from every database, every training manual, every first contact protocol. It was more than a semantic change. It was a philosophical amputation. A new classification system was drafted to take its place. It was not built on a hierarchy. It was built on the concept of technological divergence. A spectrum of development, not a ladder. This was not an academic exercise. It was an institutional upheaval. It challenged centuries of entrenched dogma. The entire foundation of xenological thought had been that technological progress was linear, that a species could be placed on a scale from simple to advanced, that their worth could be measured by the complexity of their machines. The humans of Kepler had taken that scale and broken it over their knee. A species that lived in metal boxes was not backward. It was different. Its priorities were its own. It might value adaptability over permanence, mobility over monumentality, the ability to repurpose a farming tool into a weapon, over the ability to build a perfect weapon from scratch. The choice was not a sign of deficiency. It was a sign of a different set of values. Humanity's greatest strength was redefined in the aftermath. It was not their latent technological potential. It was their foundational ethics, their stubborn, hard-won commitment to consent, and their relentless, terrifying ingenuity, their ability to see a system, any system, and ask not what it was designed for but what it could be made to do. This was not a trait that showed up on a standard scan for energy signatures or quantum coherence. It was a quality of mind, a cultural engine that powered their survival. The failed experiment on Kepler became the foundational case study for a new school of xenological thought. It was required reading for every cadet, every scientist, every diplomat. It was not studied for its tactical outcomes. It was studied for its catastrophic failures in assessment. It proved beyond any doubt that survival instinct and rapid improvisation were not signs of a lack of intelligence. They were a different form of intelligence entirely. A practical, applied genius that could defeat theoretical superiority through sheer creative will. The galaxy learned a hard, expensive lesson. A species' worth cannot be measured by the contents of its databanks. It must be measured by its actions under pressure, by the choices it makes when challenged, by the ethical lines it will not cross and the principles it will fight to defend. Technology could be acquired. Knowledge could be learned. But the character of a civilization is forged in its history. It is revealed in a crisis. The clash of civilizations ended not with a war but with a lesson too costly to learn twice. The Directorate had lost a ship's worth of pride and a mountain of outdated assumptions. They had gained a new, more humbling, and ultimately more accurate view of the universe. The story closes on a simple, sobering idea. Some truths are too profound to be taught in a classroom. Some truths about respect, about difference, about the dangers of arrogance, can only be learned through the shock of total failure. The humans did not win with weapons. They won with a mirror. They forced a superior force to see its own reflection, and the sight was so unsettling it changed the course of galactic history. The word primitive was gone. In its place was a silent, permanent acknowledgement that the universe is far more complex and far more dangerous than any simple label could ever capture. The Kepler outpost is not remembered as a battlefield. It stands now as a birthplace. The site of the confrontation was not paved over or abandoned. It was preserved. It became a museum, a monument to the precise moment galactic ethics were reborn. The air there is quiet now. Visitors walk the same ground where engineers turned farming equipment into weapons. They stand in the shadow of the same metal boxes Commander Vex once dismissed as primitive. Those structures were not torn down. They were encased in transparent alloy. Their rough-hewn seams and welded patches left exactly as they were. They are a testament to the raw ingenuity that defied an entire armada. They are proof that adaptability is its own form of power. This story is now mandatory reading. It is taught to every young cadet in the Directorate's academies. It is drilled into every new science officer. It is the ultimate warning against hubris. The lesson is not about tactics or technology. It is about the danger of assumption, the peril of believing your own culture's superiority as a fact of the universe. They study the chain of errors not to learn how to fight better, but to learn how to think more clearly. Commander Vex's name is synonymous with catastrophic miscalculation. His is the face of the failure. His final report is a key text, studied for its unflinching honesty. His name is not just a warning. It is also associated with a painful, necessary truth. He was the one who stood before the High Council and admitted the old ways were broken. His disgrace served a purpose. It became the foundation for a new, more humble way of operating. He is remembered not as a villain, but as a catalyst. Dr. Kirathane's initial report is framed and placed in ethics courses across the galaxy. The words, persistent fungal infection, are displayed in a clear case. Directly beside it, on a matching screen, is the recording of Luna Torres's first transmission. Her calm, absolute declaration of principle. The two documents are presented together. They are a perfect example of how a scientific viewpoint can be completely blinded by prejudice. They show how easily data can be twisted to fit a preconceived narrative. It is a lesson in intellectual humility that every new generation must learn. The humans, once the silent subjects of an experiment, are now sought-after partners. The Directorate and other galactic powers actively seek them out for genuine scientific ventures. They are no longer specimens. They are colleagues. Their unique expertise has become a valuable galactic export. They are masters of adaptive technology, of taking limited tools and finding revolutionary applications. More importantly, they are consultants on ethical frameworks. They help other civilizations build the safeguards and review boards that they themselves learned to build the hard way. Their painful history is now a guide for others. The declaration of war was never about conquest. It was a declaration of principle. That principle, that consent is non-negotiable, did not just win a standoff. It reshaped the stars. It rewrote the rules of engagement for every civilization under them. The legacy of Kepler is not a list of battles won or lost. It is a quiet outpost on a frontier world. A museum that reminds every visitor that some lines should never be crossed. That respect is not a courtesy. It is the bedrock of any lasting progress. The metal boxes still stand. They are a silent, permanent rebuke to arrogance and a monument to the power of a simple, unwavering idea. The true victory was not measured in wreckage or surrender. It was won in the silent council chambers and reformed protocols. The humans did not overpower a foe. They forced a civilization to look into a mirror and change what it saw. They proved that curiosity without consent is not science. It is predation. The story of Kepler endures as a permanent reminder. Some lines should never be crossed. Underestimation is a fatal flaw. In the vast quiet between stars, respect is the only language every civilization understands. It is the first word and the last.